Thank you very much, Wendy, for that lovely introduction, and also I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, and I'm very, very pleased to have had a warm invitation to come and join a really great panel. I've got, as will be revealed shortly, Mark and I have never met before. And in fact, we didn't even get a chance to say, well, what are you talking about? But I'm about to cover some very similar ground. And so I always think at moments like that, you know what, I think we're onto something here. When we've really done some deep thinking in very separate and different environments, and we're actually coming up with some of the same solutions. Now, of course, in case you hadn't noticed, we are into a sort of kind of a federal election phase. And I started my job with ACOS in the heat of the last federal election. And some of you heard me say before, because in this job, my job was to listen to every single word that came out of the mouth of the candidates, and particularly the two leaders. I was really struck by the fact that not once on any occasion did I hear either of the leaders in that election campaign use the term poverty or refer to the term homelessness. Not once in the whole entire campaign. So, as Paul was saying, one of the big purposes of the Australians for Affordable Housing campaign is for us to at least be getting a conversation going about this in the debate, particularly in the context of public policy and the bidding war. We've got a bidding war going on about paid parental leave, and wouldn't it be great for us to have a bidding war going on about some of the issues that are very close to your heart in this room? Yes, the truth is that whilst we've clearly got some economic challenges, Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So on any number of measures now, you'll see that, for example, our median wealth per household is the highest globally. And we are also have had 20 years of sustained economic growth. And we measure that. In fact, we measure that incessantly, and we talk about economic growth, GDP, incessantly. What we don't measure as a nation incessantly is the level of poverty and inequality in Australia. In fact, it was of a significant surprise to me in a former role when I went on the search. I was giving a speech and I wanted to be able to tell the story of the experience of poverty in women. And I could not find a really concise source of even just giving us a statistic at that point. Now, that was a number of years ago. ACOS did its first poverty analysis in 2007. And last year we repeated the study to create a measure of what is the level of poverty that's being experienced in Australia. So supported by Anglicare and a number of other of our members, we were able to produce the data on this picture, and it's pretty grim actually. And what you find is that 2.2 million people are living below the very conservative measure of poverty in Australia. So that is the OECD measure of 50% of median wages. 2.2 million people and over 500,000 children. So that's 1 in 6 children are living below the poverty line. Thanks, Adrian. I've got 2 glasses of water. Thank you. And the statistics mean something. What we were also able to demonstrate is that from the first time this study was done in 2007, not only has there been an increase in the number of people living below the poverty line, but there's been an increase in the rate of poverty. In other words, the experience of poverty is a growing experience in Australia, not something that we are on any measure ameliorating by a whole range of policies and measures. Now, this story is deeply structural. And if you were to focus on what are some of the major things that we need to do to address poverty, poverty isn't always with us. I think there's a bit of a tendency to think, well, look, it's an individual experience. This can happen to anybody, and it can. But there's very little that we can do about it. the reason that we have been seeing this rise in the rate of poverty in Australia, and including amongst households with children, is particularly on two fronts, one of which is that we have had the growing devaluing of the income support payments that people receive. You may be well aware that ACOS and many others across the community, including the Business Council of Australia, who today again said the unemployment payment is just too low at $35 a day. And that payment hasn't been increased in real terms in over 2 decades. So compared to wages, it is seriously now falling further and further behind. And we've been able to get the Business Council and others on board to support the increase in the unemployment payment, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it matters from a productivity point of view, because people are now so desperate with their experience of a lack of income that the very idea of them, beyond meeting their compliance obligations, turning up at Centrelink and applying for those 5 jobs a fortnight, they are in absolute crisis and destitution. And so the risk of them remaining further and further longer term on the unemployment payment because they are not able to have the capacity around them to be out there and securing a sustainable job is a very real experience. And I'm sure many of you know people who have been in that situation. And when it comes to children, the other part of the story is the family payments have also been frozen in their real value. So family payments used to be indexed to wages, and a number of years ago the indexation was changed to be linked to CPI, which is a much lower indexation. Every dollar counts in these households. And of course, one of the major deeply disturbing changes in our income support system is the increasing shifting of people from the higher pension arrangements, such as the disability support pension and the single parent payment, onto the unemployment payments. You will know that as of 1 January this year, the last group of single parents who, once their child turned 8, were moved off the parenting payment onto the unemployment payment. So that they took a cut of between $60 a week up to about $110 a week, which is a massive cut in income when many of your costs are fixed. And that legislation went through the Australian Parliament on the same day to cut those single parent payments on the same day that the Prime Minister gave her misogyny speech. So this is a very deliberate policy that we're seeing here of moving more and more people off the higher pensions and onto an unemployment payment, and yet we've had a stubborn refusal at this point for that payment to be increased. Of course, the other major driver of the increase in the experience of poverty is housing costs. And Paul has given you some really powerful research there, I think, and the expertise is in this room as well, where we clearly know that the investment that we have had in affordable housing is not having the impact that we so clearly need. Every year, ACOS runs our Australian Community Sector Survey. So we go out and we ask you to tell us the story of what you are seeing out there in the community. And for those of you who have completed that survey at some point, I want to deeply thank you, because it's quite long and it's a bit of a drag to do it, but it's an incredibly important piece of research, because what it does is it brings to the surface not the drag data. When we do the poverty analysis, that data is often quite old, but what you tell us is what you are seeing right now. And our most recent Australian Community Sector Survey confirmed that, in your view, and not just people in housing and homelessness services, the single most important thing that Australian governments could do to alleviate poverty and inequality in Australia was to fix the affordable housing crisis. So this is in everybody's face, to see that, in fact, the thing that undermines people's capacity to live with dignity and to live with respect is the lack of decent, affordable housing. So in that survey, nearly 3 out of 5 of you listed housing as the highest need for the clients that you were working with. 81% of you said you couldn't meet the demand for this service. And 63% of you said that the wait times for this had increased. There was some good news in the survey, which showed that the rate of turnaway was going down. Now, we think, and we've consulted with specialists in the homelessness, our members from the homelessness and housing sectors, who believe that the fact that we are seeing a slight decrease in the turnaway of people is because there has been this significant, if not enough, significant investment in some new social housing and also investment in the referral systems that go on. So what we think we've seen there is that people are at least getting to the right place earlier and are not being referred to services that are not suitable for them as much as they have been in the past. But it's still a really grisly picture. As Wendy mentioned, my former life was in human rights law, and so I really do love that Queensland Shelter says that housing is a human right, because it is. It is. It's in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that Australia has the obligation not only to prevent forced evictions, and I think we see far too many of those in Australia, and we have no legal protection from that, but also Australia has an obligation to the maximum of its available resources, 20 years of strong economic growth, to progressively realise the human right of all of us to adequate housing. Adequate meaning affordable, accessible, decent and safe. Some of you may remember that back in 2007, a number of advocates were successful in securing the agreement of the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing to come to Australia, Maloon Kathari. Was anybody involved in meetings with him during that period? It was 2006 he visited Australia. So this role within the United Nations human rights system is the person that goes around the world investigating the extent to which governments are meeting their obligations under this International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights about the right to adequate housing. His tour was pretty quick. I think he was in the country for about a week and he travelled all over. But I do encourage you to track down this report, because for somebody who was only in the country for a week, I think he really nailed it. He said he was particularly troubled by the inadequate housing and living conditions that he witnessed in some parts of the country, given that Australia is one of the wealthiest developed countries with a comparatively small population. He notes, unfortunately, this situation is not acknowledged by the authorities. This section of his report is called A Hidden National Housing Crisis. Throughout my visit, I have come to believe that there is a serious hidden national housing crisis in Australia. This crisis affects many sections of the population, and though having a critical and direct impact on the most vulnerable groups of the population, its impact is also on all other segments of Australian society, but particularly in the households of people on low incomes. I am puzzled that whilst the housing problems I have encountered have been present for decades, no efficient result has been achieved on these issues. I fail to understand why housing is not considered a national priority, and so do we. I note a large number of studies and reports, thank you Mark, thank you to Paul, have made suggestions for ameliorating the system and for dealing with it. But unfortunately, I note that none of these findings have, all of these findings have largely been ignored. And in his view, one of the main factors for this lack of response was the lack of clarity for responsibility between the Commonwealth and the states. And I think this is one of our biggest challenges, that in the trying to get a debate going, it is very easy for this to be subsumed into either it's your responsibility, not ours, or actually this is a market and there's very little that we can do. The truth, of course, is very different. In the time I have, I don't have enough to take you through some of our views around housing and tax policy, but it certainly ACOS believes that this is the right time for us to start to really be driving that debate around the way the tax system is undermining our efforts to secure investment into affordable housing, and also is unnecessarily inflating the housing market and basically allowing those with wealth to accumulate more and those without to really struggle to do so. We've held a recent roundtable where we've looked in detail at the Henry recommendations on housing and tax policy, and we will shortly be releasing a position paper to go into the federal election. Because ACOS we plan to do our part, along with Australians for Affordable Housing and all others, to make sure that affordable housing is a part of the federal election debate. The bit that's common with myself and Mark is I agree. I think we need to be framing this in the context of the productivity challenge of Australia, and to be asserting very clearly that housing is a part of our infrastructure. Lots of politicians love to talk about infrastructure, but they're usually meaning bridges and roads and things like that. And we want to get housing into that debate. And I think the other part is obviously very important, that we show the human face of this experience. We've had a number of people who've now been prepared to talk with us, to talk personally about what it's like in the media context of being evicted, and I think that's a really important part of us in engaging at the emotional level, whilst we also engage at the deep public policy level, making the case on both economic and social terms to improve the supply of affordable housing in Australia. Thank you.